The storm had rolled in from the north sometime after sundown, long fingers of rain dragging over the open country until the dust turned to mud and the stars drowned in cloud. Will Carter rode through it anyway. He had left town too late, too angry, and too drunk to care what the sky meant to teach him. His hat sagged against his forehead, brim dripping, shoulders soaked. The gelding under him snorted, uneasy in the thunder, but Carter pressed him on until the faint yellow shape of the ranch house flickered in the dark like a single candle left for the lost. The porch light meant Tom Jenkins was still awake. Jenkins owned half the cattle in the county and most of the debts besides. Carter owed him more than any man should ever owe another. He tied off his horse and stomped through the puddles toward the steps. His boots sank deep, the earth sucked at him as if trying to hold him back. Inside, behind a cracked windowpane, laughter rang sharp and male. The sound of whiskey glasses clinking followed it. Carter wiped his sleeve across his face and pushed open the door. The air inside was thick with smoke and wet wool. Jenkins sat at the head of the table, a stack of cards in one hand and a smirk in the other. Around him were three men from the trail crew, rough types who looked like they hadn't seen a bath or a conscience in a season. In the corner, near the stove, a woman sat with her wrists tied and her face turned toward the wall. "Well, if it isn't my favorite debtor," Jenkins said, slapping his cards down. "Come to pay up or make it worse." Carter stood dripping on the plank floor, hands trembling from cold and shame. "You sent word you had something for me." "I do." Jenkins poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a dirty glass and slid it across the table. "You keep losing at poker, but maybe you'll win at life. That girl there, bought her off the wagon train boys when they came through. Couldn't feed her, they said. Figured you might make use of her on that lonely spread of yours." Carter looked toward the figure by the stove. She didn't move. Her dress was torn at the sleeve, her hair a mess of dust and rain. Something about the way she sat, straight, still, proud despite the rope, made his stomach twist. "I don't need nobody," he said. "You need someone to keep your house," Jenkins replied. "Someone to cook, clean, maybe listen when you start talking to the ghosts again. You're 2 months behind on payment, Will. I can take your cattle, or you can take her. We'll call it even." The men laughed, thinking it a fine joke. Carter stared at the whiskey, then at the rope on her wrists. The rain outside beat harder against the roof, drowning out his heartbeat. "Untie her," he said. Jenkins shrugged. "Once you sign." The paper slid across the table. It wasn't legal, not in any decent town, but there was no decent town within 100 miles. Carter took the pen. His name scratched across the line like a wound. Jenkins grinned and cut the rope. The woman stood slowly. She was taller than he'd expected, eyes dark as burned coffee. She looked at him once, just once, and he felt the floor tilt under his boots. Then she turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, voice rough from silence. "Mara." Carter nodded. "Come on, then." He led her out into the rain. The men's laughter followed them like dogs nipping at their heels. Dash dash dash. The ride home was wordless. The storm had gentled to a cold drizzle, but the road was still a ribbon of mud. Carter kept his eyes on the horizon, on the thin outline of the cottonwood ridge where his ranch squatted against the wind. Every so often he glanced back. Mara rode stiff in the saddle he'd borrowed for her, skirts clinging to her knees, chin lifted as if daring the night to break her. He wanted to say something, anything that didn't sound like an apology, but the words stayed locked behind his teeth. By dawn they reached the ranch. The house was small, built from pine and stubbornness, one room for sleeping, another for living, and a lean-to kitchen that leaked when it rained. Smoke from last week's fire still clung to the hearthstones. He helped her down, unsure if she'd take his hand. She didn't. She followed him inside and stood by the door while he lit a lamp. "You can dry off by the stove," he said. "There's coffee left from yesterday." She looked around, taking in the bare table, the unmade bed, the wall of tools, and the Bible on the shelf, cracked open to the book of Job. Her voice was quiet. "You bought me." He flinched. "It wasn't. You paid a man for me," she said, eyes steady on him. "Whatever you tell yourself, that's what happened." He rubbed a hand over his face. "I don't want nothing from you don't choose to give." "Then what am I doing here?" He had no answer that didn't taste like dirt. "Because I couldn't leave you with him." For a moment neither spoke. The rain on the roof became a rhythm, slow and even. Then Mara moved to the stove, crouched, and started feeding it wood. Her hands were quick, practiced. She didn't ask for permission. Carter went to the porch. He stood there watching the sun lift itself over the plains, gold spilling across the wet grass. He thought of the signature on that paper, the way Jenkins had smiled, the way she'd said "You bought me." The wind cut through his coat, but it was the memory of her voice that made him shiver. Days stretched into weeks. Mara kept to herself, silent except for the necessary words of work. Where's the flour? The fence is down by the south pasture. The horse limps. She moved through the house like a shadow that cleaned and mended and cooked but never rested. Carter tried to pay her wages, tried to hand her the small roll of bills he'd hidden in a jar, but she refused to touch it. "You paid already," she said once, eyes hard. No more. He wanted to tell her she was free to leave, that he'd never stop her, but he was afraid she might take him at his word. So he said nothing. He built fences, rode the range, fixed the roof. The silence between them grew heavy but not cruel. Sometimes, when he came in from the fields, he'd find her standing outside watching the sunset, hair unbound, the light catching on her face. She never turned when he approached, and he never dared step closer than a few paces. One night a coyote got into the chicken coop. He heard the squawking and grabbed his rifle. By the time he reached the yard, Mara was already there, lantern in hand. The coyote lunged, teeth flashing. She swung the lantern and missed. Carter fired once, clean through the heart. The animal fell still. The silence that followed was louder than the gunshot. Mara's hands shook. Carter took the lantern from her and set it down. "You all right?" She nodded, though tears streaked her dusty face. "I hate killing." He wiped his sleeve across her cheek before he could stop himself. She didn't move away. For a second they stood like that, breathing the same cold air, the smell of blood and oil between them. Then she stepped back, voice low. "Thank you." He wanted to say, "For what?" But she was already walking toward the house. That night he dreamed of her, nothing carnal, just her voice saying his name as if it meant something worth saving. Winter came early that year. The hills turned white, the creek froze, and the cattle pushed close to the barns. Mara took to wearing one of his old coats, sleeves rolled to her wrists. She worked harder than he did some days. When he offered help, she refused it. When he asked about her past, she closed up. But little by little, small things changed. She laughed once when a calf tried to chew her braid. She hummed while baking bread. She placed a sprig of sage in a cracked bottle on the table, and the smell filled the room like something holy. Carter started keeping track of the days by her laughter, rare and precious as rain. He told himself she deserved better than a man like him, but he couldn't imagine the house without her footsteps in it. Then, one afternoon, a rider came from town. Jenkins' foreman. A heavy man with a black hat and a voice like gravel. He dismounted slow, spat into the snow, and said, "Jenkins wants what's his." Carter felt his gut turn. "She ain't his. Paper says different. She's not property." The man smiled, showing a gold tooth. "That's your opinion. Jenkins figures you owe more than she's worth anyway. He's callin' the debt back in. Either you pay or she comes with me." Mara had come to the doorway, face pale but steady. "I'm not going," she said. The foreman tipped his hat. "Don't matter what you want, miss." Carter stepped between them. "Tell Jenkins he'll get his money in a week. You got 3 days. When the man rode off, Mara stared at Carter. "He'll come back with more." "I know." She folded her arms. "Then we should leave." "Leave where?" "Anywhere he ain't." He looked out over the white fields. The thought of running felt both right and cowardly. "This is my home. It's his, if you stay." That night he sat by the fire long after she'd gone to bed, staring at the flames. He thought of all the years he'd spent breaking horses, fixing fences, paying off debts that never ended. He thought of Mara's hands, of the way she'd said "You bought me," and how he'd been trying ever since to undo that truth. Maybe this was his chance. Maybe redemption wasn't found by staying put but by choosing to walk away. At dawn he hitched the wagon. Mara came out with a bundle of blankets and her small tin box of things. "You sure?" she asked. He nodded. "You lead the way." They drove south, following the river until the land opened into low plains. For the first time in months, the air smelled of something other than smoke and guilt. They stopped by a grove of cottonwoods, made a small fire, and shared bread and coffee. The silence between them was easier now, not heavy, just full. "Where will we go?" she asked. "Maybe New Mexico," he said. "Start over." She studied him, the lines around his eyes, the tiredness in his shoulders. "You think running will fix what you did?" He met her gaze. "No. But maybe it'll give you a choice." Mara looked toward the river. "I already chose to stay when I could have gone. But if you're asking whether I forgive you," she paused, drawing a breath that trembled. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. But you're trying. That's worth something." Carter nodded. "That's more than I deserve." "Maybe." Her eyes softened. "But less than you think." The wind shifted, carrying the sound of hooves in the distance. They both turned. Riders, 3 of them, black against the morning light. Jenkins hadn't waited 3 days. Carter reached for his rifle. "Get behind the wagon." Mara didn't move. "You can't shoot your way free." "I can try." She caught his arm. "If you do, you'll never be free. You'll just be another man they say couldn't pay his debts." He looked at her hand on his sleeve, then at the riders closing in. Snow began to fall again, soft and relentless. He lowered the rifle. When Jenkins rode up, grinning beneath his fur collar, Carter felt a strange calm. "You came early," he said. "Business couldn't wait," Jenkins replied. His eyes slid to Mara. "I see you kept her well." Carter's voice was steady. "She's not yours. You'll leave her be. Or what? Or I tell the sheriff about your paper. About the wagon train. About every woman you've traded like cattle." Jenkins laughed. "You think anyone'll believe you?" "Maybe not," Carter said. "But they'll believe her." Mara stepped forward, chin high. "I'll tell them." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Jenkins's grin faltered. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," Carter said. "But it's mine to make." He pulled the paper from his coat, creased, damp, the ink fading, and tossed it into the fire. The flames caught fast, curling the edges into black lace. Jenkins swore, started to dismount, but the foreman held him back. "You'll regret this," Jenkins said. Carter shook his head. "Already do." They left without another word. The wind swallowed the sound of their retreat. Mara watched the smoke rise from the burning paper until nothing remained but ash. After a long silence, she said, "Now what?" Carter looked at her. "Now we start paying what we really owe." She smiled, faint and weary. "To who?" "To each other," he said. They stood there until the snow covered the ashes, and the sky broke open with light.